In this video, I'm going to show you how to go from this to this, or even this, using a changeable button technique. So let's get started. The first thing that we need to do is actually finish the button back. So I'm using a very large button for this example, but as you can see, it's a sworn knot, so it's got a little bit of the threads there. And I really don't want to put a complete cover over all of this so that you would see the fabric. I'd rather that whatever I put this button onto, you would see the fabric of the button. So for instance, if it's that, you'll see a little bit of white through it and so on. It'll just be a subtle thing, but this is just what I want to do for this particular button. So I'm going to use circle gauge and I'm going to use a little piece of felt. And I'm going to take a little look and say, well, okay, I think that if I go around this one, which is outside of dot 1, I've marked the dots in with Sharpie, but they are engraved on this. So outside of dot 1 should just about cover up the main workings here of this particular rose. And I'm just going to cut a little piece out of felt. It'll save me having to worry about hemming. Although of course you can just use fabric and hem around it if you prefer. I'm just going to cut that out. Keep it as neat as I can. If you ever have trouble cutting circles out of felt for the backs of your buttons, you can of course place a button on it and sort of cut round that, but you can also use like pinking shears or edged scissors and just give it an edge, and then it's like, oh yeah, that's cute. Nobody will know. So now I'm going to just stitch this in place. I'm going to use some linen. It's a little bit thick for what I perhaps would normally use, but I'm hoping that despite the fact that it does match, more or less, you will still be able to see what I'm doing. I was going to do it a completely different color, but I don't think I could live with it afterwards, so. Okay, now I'm going to stitch the back on to the back of the button. And I'm going to use some linen thread. Just use some regular sewing thread, whatever you've got. I'm using the linen, it's a little bit thicker, I'm hoping that you'll be able to see it. I'm using a long darner. As you can see, I've bent it a little bit. When my joints flare up a little bit, and sometimes sewing can be a little bit difficult, I find that using a longer sharp needle is easier than using short, sharp sewing needles. So I'm just going to, now this is an awkward thing to do because you don't want to go through to the front of your thread, of your button. And of course, if I'd have sewn it onto the edge, I could have used the ridge. So if you want to do a big piece, you can just attach to the ridge of the button the blanket stitch that you've worked. But as I say, I want to keep a little bit of that transparency that is there. So it's basically just a case of taking your needle and catching on the threads at the back. You can put a little bit of glue here if you want, underneath here if you want to as well, which can help to hold the button, the backing onto the button, and so therefore strengthen your button generally. So I'll just carry on and do this. So a bit of rough and ready, not the most perfect stitching, but it is at least secured. And I'm just going to pop a little knot, and then I'm going to take the thread underneath and bring it up wherever at the back, pull a bit tight, and then just snip that, and that'll hide that end of thread. So that is now covering the workings at the back there of the button. I've not come through at the front, but it is important to make sure that your stitches do actually hold, because you're going to be sort of stitching onto this. So there is the button prepared. Now the next thing that we need to do is we need to remove the original button from the coat. Now, it's a good idea to just have a little see about how far and how long the shank is. So you can use anything to gauge it. I'm using our buttonhole tool. And so that, for this particular one, is fine. That's about 3 millimeters. So that's the sort of basic that we have to start with. So just bear that in mind. So I'm just going to cut away this button. Now obviously this is a permanent thing, so you will have to make changeable buttons. We can just about feel where that original button was, but I'm just going to put a little mark just so I don't lose it. Okay. Now the next thing to do is to choose your back button. Now I'm going to choose quite a small back button, and I want to make sure that I can do basically I need to line up, and I'm going to do a little buttonhole. Now, I know you can't really see that very well, but it's the right size. So I'm sorry that it's not the most obvious, but it doesn't matter. So I'm just going to do a little buttonhole. I'm going to do it pretty tight. So I think I'll mark off for that one. And I'm going to do quite a rough and ready one here as well, actually, because sorry, my pencil's not sharp enough to actually go down there. So let's just see, that should about do it. It's not going to be the best and tidiest little buttonhole in the world, but no one's going to see it. I am going to use a slightly lighter thread in the hopes that you'll be able to see what I'm doing a little bit on camera. But I will zip through this more or less. I'm not going to do a tailor's buttonhole. I'm just going to do a regular buttonhole. Now when you do this, you do need to be able to go right the way through both of the layers. So it is going to take a little bit of time. If you're like me, you're working on some wool. So I will just quickly tack this out so that you can see what I'm doing, and then I will go through, make a buttonhole myself, and then come back and show you what I've done. Don't think you need to see this if I'm not actually teaching it. Maybe I'll do another video if you want of different buttonhole styles. And again, I'm using the long needle for exactly the same reason as I said before. Okay, so just going to carry on and work a buttonhole along here. So there we have it, one quick rough and ready buttonhole. And because it's on the inside, you won't actually really see it much. However, of course, if you're using a coat, you want to really ideally have it matching threads, not the brown. Just make sure that your back button, as I call it, will go through. And so long as that will, we know we're on a roll. So I'll just move the coat out of the way. Now we have to join this to this, okay? And we have to do it so that we have a space in between. Now, as you know, I use the little, our buttonhole tool. And normally, if I was sewing directly onto fabric, that would be enough. I would do that, and then that will give us the space. But really, ideally, I need double that thickness, at least, to put these two together. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to also use the buttonhole marker, this tab here, to just bring it up a little as I'm doing it. The two buttons can't be too tight together. They're almost better to be too loose initially because you can adjust afterwards if you need to. So I'm going to, again, back to my strong linen thread. I think that you'll be able to see this quite nicely then. Just getting a little bit of beeswax out of my tin. And I will just pop some beeswax on the linen just to help it along a little bit. I am going to use the thread singly, but you can use double if you like, it doesn't matter. And just not the end. So I'm going to just take the thread underneath that felt backing, just so that I can hide the knot basically. I can just draw it through underneath. And then I'm going to do a little stitch that is actually grabbing hold of some of those threads underneath as well. And that's just to secure my thread. Now I need to sew the thread to the button. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to put it through both the buttons. Now you can use anything to mark your space. You know, you can use a pencil. A pencil works quite well actually because of the gap that you want. But it depends on the jacket. You know, if you're putting it on a linen jacket, you want everything a lot closer than you will with a wool jacket, as I'm doing. So I'm just going to pop that under there, just as if I was sewing on a button. Only this time I'm also going to just pop this underneath. Now I can catch it and work around if I want to, but I think I should be okay just supporting the button itself, not trying to line anything up underneath, because it'll get a little complex otherwise. But I just want to make sure that what I'm doing is I'm not taking it too close, if that makes sense. So I'm sort of doubling up. So I'm just using that as an extra support as I come through. So I'm at the fabric, I want to come back up through the button. You can do this with any kind of button, it's not just thread buttons, but it's really nice if you want a really big button on something. If you do it a bit loosely in the first place, you can then tighten up, because it does get awkward because you've not got a shank. Now if you have a shank on the back of your button, that changes it again, because you need to obviously take into account the shank itself. And that's where you can get into, you can use vintage buttons, or if you have finished your thread buttons with shanks, which I do sometimes. So I think I'll do the 4. That should be enough to be starting with. And then I'm just going to tighten this down a little bit. I just caught that end. I don't want to do that. Do not want to catch any of the other threads on the button. So I'll just press it. And that's the bit you really have to make sure that you don't do. Okay, so I'll tighten that up a little bit, each thread at a time. Okay, so there is the first of the shank. Now I think that's probably going to be all right, that gap. It's a little bit bigger than I originally intended, but I should be able to work that around. Now you can just wrap around it if you like to make a shank as you traditionally would for a buttonhole, or you can weave through and make something a little more delicate. If you wrap up, then come up through a hole, work down, and wrap again back down towards your decorative button. Okay, and that will help to just give a little bit more of a strength to it. Okay, and then I'm just going to fasten that off. Basically all you want to do is make sure that they're pretty securely attached to each other, and that it's not going anywhere. If you need to adjust it because your fabric is much thicker or you've made it too large, it's sometimes easier to just cut it off and start again, I will be honest with you, if you get it wrong. But you can also sort of catch your shank and tuck it in a little bit if it's required. Obviously, if it's way too short, you're really going to need to just start again. So I knotted that and again carried it through to another place so that I can just snip that off. So now we have a big button with a back button. Okay, can you see that? And the way that you use it on your coat or whatever else, I mean, you can use this for handbags as well, so you could change them up quite easily, is you come through the original buttonhole and then you take the back button through the new buttonhole that you created. And then whatever it is that you're doing up is done up permanently with that nice big bold button. Now, of course, if you want to take your coat off, you have to make sure that you do it so that you don't lose your button. Now, in most cases, just by undoing from the back, that's fine. You probably won't lose your button because you still have some space. But if you're in doubt, you can always sort of tuck it into your bag or whatever anyways, or into your pocket. I've done this method, I've actually done this method a long time ago on a coat, and I changed every single button like this, which was a little bit of a pain doing it up in the first place, but it looked so fantastic and I was able to change buttons all of the time. But it's really nice if you just want to change just the one. And it's nice and secure because your button has gone through to the back and your big button is on the front. Right, so I said that we could use old buttons or decorative buttons. So the principle is exactly the same. So remember that you can do that. So for instance, with this one, I will use the same back button because I had two. The first thing that you need to do, of course, is you need to fasten your thread well onto it, your back button. So what I would advise you to do for if you're doing this, because you've not got anything to sort of sew through and knot, is to use your thread double. So if you can just bear with me while I get this needle threaded up. So if you use your thread double, you can catch it. So I'm going to do a nice knot at the end, join them up. And again, I have waxed this linen, and if you choose to use cotton or something, you wouldn't need to wax it. I'm going to go through, back down, and then I'm going to catch in that loop of that double thread. And that is going to secure the beginning of the thread. So then I can put it through the shank of the decorative button. And again, we do need to make sure that there's that space in between. So whilst it's not easy, the alternative way of doing it is to loop through. Don't catch any of your threads if you can help it, because you won't be able to slide them through. But if you go ahead and do that, and you can do this on a thread button as well, loop it up first, then you can put your gauge in, and you can start to tighten up. You just sort of ease it down, and then I'm going to put the second one in so that I don't get it too tight, and then ease that down, and then we'll say, okay, that is about where we want it, and we can slide those off. Back to the center so that I can create a nice wrap. And then back down. Now it doesn't matter if I decide to knot it here, because obviously you're not going to see that at any point when it's in use. However, if you want it to sort of look more decorative, then certainly fasten off by knotting in between the two buttons. So again, nice space between them. Let's get that coat back. And as before, through the front, and through the back. And it is actually easier when you're standing up, and that's the one button that you've actually decided to change. There you go, a changeable button. So you can use this for any of your sort of decorative buttons, your fashion buttons, anything that you don't want to end up being you think that the coat, for instance, is going to be washed, you can use it for that. It's really great. But you, as I say, you can use it for handbags and things like that also, because it's a way of adding the button without adding it permanently. So for instance, if you made a little buttonhole on a bag or on a scarf. You can also attach the button in this way, just do it tighter, and so it's just attached onto the fabric and hanging, as opposed to having a pin, which obviously you can't always put a pin onto an old button, and sometimes even pins onto these are not so, you know, this way you can change it time and time and time and time again, whatever size. Thanks very much for watching. I hope that you found this useful, and it's shown you one way in which you can use some of your big, bold, decorative buttons and actually use them on your garments. Do please hit like, click subscribe, let me know in the comments what you'd like to see or otherwise, and I'll see if I can help out. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.